Hello, campers. This is Ed coming to you from my happy place, my virtual happy place. And you can get a happy place too if you like. If you want to, you can go to pexels.com. Let me see if I can show you that. Where would that be? Right there it is. Yes, pexels.com, Pexels.com. And if you do that, then I believe you can download your own background. And then if you run your mouse down in the screen you're now looking at where that says stop video, there's a little arrow pointing up. And if you click on that, it has a little disclosure that says choose virtual background, and you can upload your own background. Try not to get too epileptic, or anything like that, but why not have fun? Right? Okay. Anyways, I digress. The reason I'm here today is to talk about masks and how important they are and how they'll trickle down to pretty much everything else you do in Photoshop. Before that, though, I'd like to show you one of my heroes. And so, one of the people that was one of my heroes that I want to show you is Jerry Ulisman. Was an educator at Florida State University when I was teaching at Florida State a long time ago. He was one of my influences in that his students became some of my teachers at East Carolina, and was always impressed by Ulisman's eye for something that was unique, just very surrealist, obviously, but and then to realize that these were done in a traditional darkroom, not as with a computer. This is a long time before a personal computer was even invented, let alone being able to print like this. In the tonal range, he was able to get in a darkroom by registering several different negatives with several different enlargers to several different pieces of to the same piece of paper, and then having it come up with this type of resolution was mind-boggling. So it was a tour de force of technique. And also the images just sort of sticks to the rib. The thing I learned from Ulisman also, because I was being told never center anything, you never center anything as an art student. And then I looked at Ulisman's work and he was centering everything. So I was going, gosh, and it was kind of a rule made to be broken. But one of the things I learned from Ulisman is to not have it like be a Rorschach, like an ink blot, where it's the exact same on one side as it is on the other. Now you'll see some of that because the negative was just flopped. And how hard is that to do in Photoshop? Same thing with the background down in here. It's the same negative pushed over, nicely blended. But there'll be little tiny things in the roots in here that aren't exactly the same. And then over here, same thing, just that whole idea of just throwing it off symmetry just a little bit. That's one of the things I think I learned from symmetry, from Ulisman the most. Whenever I jury an art show, I've been asked to jury shows, and I leave the show after I've just sort of breezed through it and just sort of looked at the work. Sometimes it's a lot of work, over 100, 200 pieces sometimes, and then I just go get a cup of coffee or just think about it, get lunch. And when I come back, those pieces that spoke to me for whatever reason, I tend to remember. And it doesn't mean it's better or worse. It just seems like it works for me as art. So when I see an image like this, and then a couple hours later, I still remember it. And that's true with everything that Ulisman does, I think. Let's see if I can get to some of these other ones. There's one, yeah. And there's that sort of almost symmetry, with how he places things. I think I've got one behind here I can get to. So, just a flopped image with the image underneath, but, still just a haunting image. And if you've ever done a traditional photograph with red light and silver nitrate, then you understand the idea about how you burn and dodge and get the shadows exactly right. Now, things we can do now electronically and digitally, and then make multiples quite easily. But back in that day, it was very difficult. And again, you still have that subtle sort of surrealism of seeing little faces and things like that in some of these images. They're quite famous for that type of thing. Anyways, I consider him to kind of be the father of digital imaging, even though he really wasn't a digital imaging artist. I think he started using the computer, but it was really late in life. Let's just hear what he has to say.
If someone's first response to one of my images is, how did you do it? I feel I failed. I don't mind that being the second question, but their first response should be like, oh, that's, you know, strange, or gee, I can relate. Reminds me, you know, they just have some emotional, authentic, real response. Sometimes they have whole stories to tell about these things. And so that I don't have a hidden agenda. They aren't supposed to feel this way about that. It's not like some cryptic language that if you can only figure it out, you'll know exactly what's going on. Because it's below my conscious level when these things are being created. You're the carrier of the symbolic intent. Obviously, themes will reoccur, but a lot of times, if you read books on the brain, these are not at a conscious level. I'm not consciously picking out symbols. Well, if I do this, that'll refer to that. That's, no, you can't intellectually do that. But it's after the fact that you create these conditions that allow other people to find ways of connecting to them. Black and white in general gives you a broader reference, because sometimes the color itself can be so seductive that sort of adds a kind of distortion. I mean, everything has to feed in to support whatever image is being made. I can remember, well, Life magazine one time, they ran a whole series of color photographs of some war, maybe it's the Vietnam or whatever, but I remember there's these gorgeous landscapes, and you know, the color of the landscape and it was somehow in black and white, they were much more powerful in terms of being photographs of tragic events. I'm totally, because of it's the way I function, working in the darkroom with black and white. And I was brought up at a time when, you know, the leading films were the Bergman films, that if something was serious, it was in black and white. I was lecturing in Boston in 1982. I showed a wave breaking, and there was this lone little boat. And I showed it after previously showing a piece that I said that I thought was Zen-like, and I said, Miner White, I think, would have liked this. Miner had died a few years before when he taught at MIT. After the lecture, a man came up to me. He said, when you mentioned the one picture you thought Miner would like, and he thought that was interesting, that was interesting. He said, but when you showed that next picture of that lone boat, he says, I was at Miner's bedside in the hospital, and his last spoken words were, there's a small boat waiting for me. And when the man told me that, I got goosebumps. And I just went back to Florida, and I kept thinking about that. And I made an image that was a variation, a boat with this sort of cloud sphere. From that day on, the boat became a metaphor for me as a spiritual kind of journey. Plus, I did then, as an academic, read about the death experience. And many people experience a tunnel of light. Our most belief systems about some body of water that people have to somehow transgress. Or you know, hear songs of gospel songs. You can go on and on about that metaphor. It's so open-ended. I just think of myself as an image maker. This is what my life is about, and I believe in photography in all its forms. It's, you know, it's my way of relating to the world and to myself. You know, you're after being authentic, being who you are, and you know, and having some sense of craft that can allow this vision to sustain itself.
And so the whole reason for showing you Ulisman's images, besides the beauty of them, is just technically it's so easy to do things like this, displace things with displacement maps, and control the ranges of values and composite things, especially digitally now, as opposed to when he was doing it in the darkroom. Let me see if I can close this out. Bring that down, and then probably don't even need this anymore. There we go. And so that brings us to the problem at hand, this idea of masking. And just to show you exactly how masks work, and we'll use the hair as an example here. We do a little bit of select mask. We're going to cover that in depth in the next chapter. But There's no other way to do things like that. And if you try to cut and paste it, it's going to look bad. Just as an example, we have the girl that we worked with in class in the tutorial. And if I turn the eyeball off and the layers over here, you can see we've got another layer down below it of just a little landscape. So another little happy place that we all like to be right now. So if I go back to the active layer here of the girl in there, I'll take a rough stab at trying to select her. But before I do, let's talk a little bit about masks. And I'll turn the eyeball off the bottom layer so it will have a transparent background if we cut her out. But if I take a rectangle and just go over here and, well, before I do that, let's go ahead and put the mask on. So if I've got the layer selected, two ways to put a mask on. One is the shortcut down here in the little bottom area. Or another way would be go over to layer and then come down to a layer mask. Either way that would get you there. Usually, because you use layers all the time, you end up just going here and getting a little shortcut. And when you do, it creates a little layer unbelievable. I'll make my background color here. And when you do, deselect, it creates a little, another layer, a layer mask. And when you do, it creates a layer mask. Jeez. So I'm going to select the girl at the top. I'm going to click the little layer button down here. And when you do, you get a little layer mask with a little lock on it to the image. And everything that's white is totally visible. Everything that's black will be invisible. So if I come over here and get a tool such as my just my regular paintbrush tool, which always paints with foreground color. So over here, I'll just reverse that to black at the front. And if I take that brush, and maybe not that brush, brushes are contextual. So if I select it, that's a pretty good size brush, and start painting, you can see I'm painting with blacks, and so that's erasing 100% of what's underneath. And if I flip it back over and paint with white over here in my background colors, I can put it back again. I can go back and forth, back and forth. So for one reason, you still have things that you can put back in if you happen to miss them. The other thing is that if I try to cut and paste it, even if I have a nice edge that I can select over here with the something like the quick select tool, when you cut it out, it puts these little jaggies on there on the edges that it's really difficult to smooth out. What I ended up doing is just taking the finger tool and smudging them and blurring them and things like that. But it's a step that you shouldn't have to do. And when you use a mask, the aliasing for taking that background out along those edges over here is much better. So when in doubt, you always want to use a mask. You'll have things to go back to. It's non-destructive. You can always go back to the original image. And another rule of thumb is to always try to do everything non-destructive. So again, to demonstrate, once I'm active in the mask over here and I paint with black, let's go back to 100% black. You can see that's going to take it out completely. And if I've got that same brush selected, and remember all the brushes, it's a contextual menu up in here. So up in here is where you can set things like the opacity. So the opacity for a brush that's black, the color, if I bring it down to 50% or maybe a little bit lower, is going to be a gray. And if I paint with a gray, it's going to take less of that out. And if I look at the thumbnail over here, I think you can see it. It's more of a light gray. So the darker the values, the more is erased. The lighter the values, a pure white, as you're painting into the surface, the less is visible. And you know, it's a mask. It's non-destructive. You can always click on it or right click on it and bring up the little dialog box. You can disable it temporarily and go, oh, that's what I missed. And then right click on it again, or I think control click on it, and then go back and enable. But you get those little pop-ups when you control click on layers, quite handy. Or layer masks in this case. You can delete it and then start over. I'm going to Command Z and put that back. And then you can Control Z, apply it. Now, if you apply it, what happens is no more layer mask. That's what the woman looks like. You've destroyed the layer. So I'm going to Command Z and put that back, and then put it back again. And then lastly, I'm going to take that layer and come down here and just select the little trash can down here in the corner and just delete it. And it asks me, it's a very polite program, do you want to apply it? No, thank you, we'll delete it. So I'm back to my original image. So you should know about masks and how they work. And then a lot of times I'll use the gradient tool as well to get the little subtleties in the mask. But that way, when you are using the set and mask, your ultimate destination, whenever you have a selection, you would be to really go in there and save that background and separate it. So let's try that. If I go over here real quickly, and I'll cover this in the next tutorial, but if I come over here to say, I always get confused with this new program because the first one is this object selection tool, and that's new in Photoshop, whatever the most recent version is. So you may not have it in the labs or at home. But if I just go to the quick selection tool, and again, the quick selection tool is just a brush I can paint on with that kind of contrast. It gives me a rough start. Now here's the deal, by the way, if you already have a selection, and we do, I just made it with the quick selection tool, as you can see. And then you go over and you apply this. Let me get this. I can rub my mouse on it. Then you hit the apply layer mask. It knows what you're trying to do. It knows that you want to mask that woman out. So if you do that, then you can see it's going to fill that background area with black. And if you don't use other tools, you're going to get a little bit of a jaggies here, you know, and things like that. And also, you're not going to get those strands of hair. So I'm going to, again, Command Z, undo that, put it right back. And instead, we'll go up to the select and mask and just not kill ourselves, but go in there and just play with it a little bit. Before we do, I'll cancel that. Let's turn the background layer on, which you can't see because this layer in front of it's opaque right now, and that's fine. So now I'll apply that select and mask. And remember, you have to have a selection already created before you'll see that. And remember, it's also over here. This is covered in depth in the next little tutorial. So if I click on that and then start over here, I usually start with something like a color overlay to view it on. And then I usually pull my opacity slider down to see what I'm missing. And then I usually start with the refine tool edge and just come in here and start to paint it and see if it gets most of the outside edge. Try to stay away from those middle areas and where it really doesn't need anything. In other words, these areas are fine. It's right in here where it needs to take that background out. So I'll try to avoid those other areas if at all possible, where it's not supposed to be opaque. I think that's looking pretty good. Now it's a good time to go over here and look at the actual mask down here to black and white. Not too bad. Looks like it got some artifacting in there. And the interesting thing is that quick selection tool also with a option key held down, see it turn to a minus, will actually take away from those selections too. It will subtract. Getting a little bit artifacting, and I'm not going to kill myself because this is going to be covered on the next tutorial. But I will go back to the red overlay and bring it up and maybe just sort of tweak the side a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and accept that. Oh, before I did, I messed up. I got a selection, so let's go back to select and mask. Okay, I'm going to come down and with that selection, make it be a new layer with layer mask. Again, that's almost always what I want. And then once I do that, it turns off the original layer and gives me a layer with a layer mask, which is what I want. And it also can show me the background. And over here, you can see it could use a little bit of work on that side. And a lot of times people will do the outside hair, just that outside hair, totally separately from the figure. They'll use that blocky one on top of this so they get those nice sharp edges all kind of resolved and do the hair separate. And it gives you a mask. And so you need to understand the mask. So if it's over here and it's got a little bit not as opaque as it needs to be, it's a mask. So if I paint it with white, foreground color over here, get my regular brush, and I'll play with that brush a little bit. And come over here and paint. It's going to put that back. Now I'm going to Command Z this. If I happen to go too far with it, I'm in the mask over here. I'm at 27%. Let's bring that up to 100%. You can see I'm kind of poking that back in there and getting that there because it's a mask. And I'll turn the eyeball off so you can kind of see the difference. You could use a little bit up in there too, right? And that's where I like a brush that's really, really soft. So you don't see that circle on the end and it really kind of just blends into those edges. This is why those edges are usually done separately. Sometimes people will tint it to get rid of that little blackness that's in there. But again, I'm not going to beat myself up for a little demo. This is working pretty good. The actual select and mask you'll want to see in the very next tutorial.